It's now time for our first talk by Manu Bazzano, an author and psychotherapist in private practice, with his talk on transindividuation, or how can we overcome the enduring split between individuals and society. So over to you, Manu.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Dal, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. Have you ever been to Southern Italy? If you haven't, well, maybe it's time to come and visit. I'm doing a talk performance on the Angel of History. This is uncanny that Dal, you brought that wonderful poetic thing from Benjamin, a philosopher poet. The important thing in Benjamin is that we have to give up the idea of progress, by the way. The idea of progress is an obstacle. The storm that keeps the angel from redeeming the past. The angel wants to redeem the past, personal and collective. You know, the massacres and genocide that keeps piling up, but also the heartbreak and of our shipwrecked personal life as well. But progress has to be given up. And there is a melancholy and a pessimism in Benjamin, which is very appealing. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. Revolution has to be tried again and again. The Bolshevik Revolution was for Benjamin a reenactment of the Paris Commune of the 1879. Anyway, the widespread belief that politics deals with external reality while psychotherapy attends to the private domain is misleading. Or at the very least, it constitutes too neat a demarcation between the outside and the inside. Still, the very real challenge for psychotherapists, for us, is summoning a convincing ontological perspective which may take us out of the impasse generated by this deeply ingrained division. The objective then would be becoming better equipped in submitting universally accepted notion to closer scrutiny. In order to do this, we may need at times to design new concepts, or at least articulate novel interpretations to hold ideas in the hope of releasing the deadlock in a particular field of practice and inquiry. One of these concepts is transindividuation, a new idea in psychotherapy, which aims to problematize, to make more difficult and expand on the notion of individuation. Have you noticed how, by the way, the individuation has disappeared from current psychotherapeutic discourse in favor of the politically compliant notion of integration? If and when it gets mentioned, individuation is restricted to the necessary but insufficient first step of finding a so-called internal locus of evaluation, of becoming more authentic, or aligning the ego with a capitalized Jungian self, probably with sound effects. Transindividuation and the closely related notion of the trans-individual is new in psychotherapy and the psych world. It surfaces partially, obliquely in Spinoza, Marx, and Freud. It was consistently then conveyed by Gilbert Simondon, whose ideas cross the borders of several fields of inquiry, and is now becoming more widely discussed in the humanities and also in the philosophy of science. I will outline some traits of this notion as they appear in Marx, Spinoza, Freud, before concentrating on Simondon. What is transindividuation? Transindividuation is a new theory of individuation. The conventional notion of individuation only takes into account the individual. That is, only an aspect, a phase of a process. Whereas transindividuation inscribes the individual within a much wider process. It goes beyond the individuated I, conventionally understood as an already formed entity. It understands the individual as contemporaneous with its individuation, an individuation contemporaneous with the principle. The principle of individuation, quote from Simondon, must be truly genetic and not simply a principle of reflection. Within this perspective, individuation must be at all times associated with a pre-individual, which is for Simondon a source of metastable states, constantly fluctuating. Another way of saying this is that there is no actualization worth of its name without a close link to a virtual field of potentialities. Transindividuation also goes beyond the equally conventional notion of the inter-individuated we. It is a process of co-individuation within a pre-individuated milieu in which both the I and the we are transformed through one another. In that sense, transindividuation constitutes the foundation for all social change. Here is Bernard Stiegler. Quote, "We ourselves as humans are a type of individuation that is very specific, as our individuation is not only a vital individuation, that is, an individuation of the living organism of life, but an individuation of the psyche as well. So it is operating as both conscious and unconscious processes." And Simondon says that individuation of the psyche is always already an individuation of a group of psyches, because a psyche is never alone. It always operates in relation to another psyche. A delimited self, himself or herself, a psyche in this situation is a very specific doubling of oneself in narcissism and a type of dialectical relationship to oneself, end quote. Crucially, in relation to psychotherapy, transindividuation takes on board the dimension of the emergent, which Simondon calls the pre-individual, a differentiated field, a bundle of potential functions, localized as a differentiated region with a larger field of potential. This is not as abstract as it may sound, but is related to how each separate area is involved in solving problems that cannot be addressed without further individuations. One concrete example is anxiety, a topic of direct concern for us, discussed by Simondon in a chapter on psychic individuation. In anxiety, the human organism feels weighed down by its existence, as if it had to carry itself, a burden of the earth, achtos arures, as Homer says, but also a burden to itself. In anxiety, we feel as if existing is a problem posed to ourselves, and this division is felt into pre-individual nature and individuated being. In anxiety, the subject attempts to, quote, resolve itself without going through the collective. It wants to come to the level of its unity, quote, by way of a resolution without mediation or delay. In this sense, end quote, anxiety is an emotion without action, a feeling without perception. It is pure reverberation of the being within itself. Crucially, if anxiety could be sufficiently shored up, it would bring about a new individuation, a true transformation. But this process, which implies a disbandment of prior structures to the point of annihilation of the seemingly solid and unitary individuated being, would require a resorting to other domains of individuation, unthinkable without a conceptual frame, such as transindividuation. Let me quote Simondon. The individual being flees itself, deserts itself, and yet in this desertion, there is a sort of underlying drive to recompose oneself elsewhere, and otherwise by reincorporating the world, such as that everything can be lived. For Spinoza, social human nature is an uneven amalgam, assemblage, what the historical Buddha called skandhas, or aggregates. So it's an aggregation of different components, not of body and mind, as most of us still assume in obeisance to Spinoza's contemporary, Descartes, but instead of moods and deeds, some of which follow reason, while others ensue from passion. As a result, and in a way that reminds one of Plato, the affective configuration of a particular individuality and its concurrence of rational and affective forces in the polis, in the city, in the public, intersect, connect, and reflect one another in this sense. And in this sense, subjectivity is already transindividual. At its core, Spinoza's thought aims at explicating different modes of communication, which at times organize themselves at the level of affects and sometimes at the level of rational ideas. It remains to be seen whether rational ideas are themselves affects, but that belongs to a different exploration. What is relevant here is that for Spinoza, the finite mode of subjectivity is relational and transindividual. His is a counter-traditional aporetic ontology, to be sure. We come to be incessantly disassembled and reassembled. We are like Humpty Dumpty. We are traversed by affects and partake them with others, with the ever-changing wider sphere of society. The ethical task in these circumstances, which is where our work becomes useful, is to be able to turn the inherent passivity of the passions into actions, and more widely, following Nietzsche, to turn passive forces into active forces. Entertaining this view could mean doing more than merely critiquing the double bind of individualism and holism in the direction of creating a structure of feeling and expression, as well as developing a set of active interventions on an individual and societal level. We are affected, we affect, and this double movement changes us, changes others. Being involved in this process may alert us to the fact that viewing ourselves as separate individuals is an attractive illusion and a second-rate mode of being in the world, a private domain that is deprived, deprived existence, depriving us of the rich trans-individual nature of our individuality. In his sixth thesis on Feuerbach, Marx critiques Feuerbach's attempt to resolve the conundrum of human nature or human essence, das menschliche Wesen, by assimilating it into the essence of religion. He affirms human nature as constituted in its effective reality, instead by the ensemble of social relations, as Dell has emphasized earlier, rather than as the universally accepted abstraction of the single person, the so-called human condition, whatever that is. This may be considered as a point of departure for an ontology of relations. Individuality is then understood neither as a separate originary substance, be it the automized soul of Christianity or the Cartesian version of the cogito, nor is it reducible to the totality which encompasses it, be the abstract Heideggeresque relatedness, now de rigueur in conventional existential therapy, or in a more concrete sense of a societal community. For Marx, however, Society and community under capitalism are akin to simulacra. They hide the reality of alienated relation, a realm where alienation constitutes the main form of relating. Again, let me emphasize, alienation constitutes our main form of relating. Capitalism does not engender nor foster a society, but merely, in the words of Louis Althusser, a society effect. There is no such thing as society, not in the sense of Maggie Thatcher, but in the sense of there is a society effect. We are a society and a community of consumers, are we not? In Marx's own words, to the producer, the social relations between the private labor appear as what they are. They do not appear as direct social relations between persons in their work, but rather as material relations between persons and social relations. I'll speed up.
I think you need to stop almost, please. It's
okay. May I come to concluding?
Yeah, sure. And then we should have time for a couple of questions.
Okay, I'll skip Freud, which is very important, but the Freud notion of a group of one. Concluding remarks, transindividuation, questions a separation between interior and external life. Even before coming into being as an individual, there is a current of pre-individual elements. Incorporating these notions into our understanding could mean becoming better equipped at imagining a community that does not step on individual needs and desires, nor neglect the importance of community. Merci bien for listening.
Thank you very much, Manu. So we've got a couple of minutes before the next talk. We can take at least one question. So would anyone like to ask any questions, please? Either unmute and ask or just raise your hand on Zoom.
Can I just sort of jump in if no one else is going to say anything? Thank you very much, Manu, for your presentation. Lots of really very interesting things, and perhaps too many things for me to sort of to think about on the spot. But I was trying to think about transindividuation, and I wonder, do you think it's starting off in the wrong place to think that some of that we might talk about Winnicott's work in that sort of way? We might talk about Winnicott as, the idea that the child comes into being in relationship with the mother and such things. Do you think that's the wrong place to?
With all respect, yes, because that's, however, it's important, but still for Simondon, it's still within the realm of we. And what he stresses is transindividuation is about taking into account the pre-individual. And of course, the pre-individual in the mother, the pre-individual in the child, the enigmatic message that the mother gives unto the child, and so forth. So yes, and transindividuation is also much wider than that. But of course, that dimension is there, perhaps central. Yeah.
Okay, no, that helps me to get more of a handle on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank
By the way, there will be a whole paper published on this, which is when you have time to read it. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, lovely. Thank you. That was a real pleasure to hear your talk, Manu, and it brings us very neatly to time and to move on to our next speakers.